to Prairie Fire Lines, the show where we spark conversations about prescribed fire and its role in conserving Canada's prairie grasslands. I'm Kat Zenz, your host and Communications and Outreach Officer for the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange. We work with partners across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba to bring fire back to the land safely, effectively, and with respect for the Indigenous traditions that have guided grassland stewardship for generations. We acknowledge that the prairie provinces that we work on are situated on Treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and the homeland of the Métis. Each episode, you'll hear from people in the fire world about how prescribed fire works, why it matters, and the many ways it helps our prairie ecosystems thrive. So cozy up by the fireplace. This is Prairie Fire Lines, where we keep the conversation burning. In today's episode, I'm speaking to Kerry Hecker, who has been the Wildlife Area Manager at the Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area and Migratory Bird Sanctuary in south-central Saskatchewan since 2004. Kerry is also a founding member of the CPPFE and a key player in planning prescribed fires across the Canadian prairies. We'll talk about how prescribed fire is used to manage her land and get her insights on taking on leadership roles on the fire line. Good afternoon, Kerry. Thank you so much for driving all the way up here to be on the podcast today. How are you?
Hi, Kat. I'm really glad to be here, and it's my privilege. I don't get out much sometimes. I stay at my wildlife area and don't get to other cities, so this is kind of fun, and I'm doing really well, thank you.
Amazing. So, for folks who might not know you yet, could you tell us a bit about who you are and the work you do?
I sure can. So, I'm Kerry Hecker. I work at the Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area, which is one of Environment Canada's protected areas. It's actually the oldest protected area in Canada.
Oh, really?
It was set aside, or at least the core of the area was set aside in 1887. I have photocopies of the original handwritten cabinet documents from Sir John A. Macdonald setting aside 2,500 acres at the north end of Last Mountain Lake for, quote, wild fowl, unquote. So it's been around for a long time, and I feel quite honored to be the person who has stewardship of it right now.
That is so cool. So how long have you been at Last Mountain Lake?
I was fortunate to start there in the year 2001 as a grassland restoration specialist. So I specialized in taking cultivated land and planting it back to an approximation of native prairie. So high diversity wildflowers and grasses that would have grown there naturally. After that, I managed to get the manager's job 3 years in, and yes, I've been managing Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area since 2004, and that's getting to be a long time.
Amazing. So what inspired you to take on this role and to join Last Mountain and join the world of resource management and ecology and wildlife management?
Well, I saw it as an absolute necessity. I love nature. I was one of those kids that grew up with their pockets full of bugs and bringing frogs home to my mother's dismay, and just absolutely loved it. I used to spend at least a few weeks each summer on my grandparents' farm, which was near Maple Creek, and I'm only realizing now what a gift that was. It was just amazing to have weeks to just go exploring. And there's things that I found there that I now know the names for, like scarlet mallow, which I called my little wild roses. And there's a little pseudoscorpion that lives in little holes in the ground around there that I used to watch them for hours. It was quite fun. And so that side of things was, I don't know, well developed in little Kerry. And so when I got to the age to go to university and do something, I really wanted to, number one, not live in a city, and number two, do something to benefit the natural world around us. And yeah, resource management is where that's at.
So could you tell me a bit more about the purpose of Last Mountain Lakes National Wildlife Area, and maybe explain more about wildlife areas in general in Canada?
For sure. So wildlife areas are land managed by Environment Canada, particularly the Canadian Wildlife Service, that's set aside specifically to be wildlife habitat. In the grasslands of Canada, originally they would put a fence around the wildlife area and just set it aside, and it was preserved. But it became obvious that that wasn't the way to keep it in good shape. Grasslands need ecosystem processes. If you put a fence around them and let nothing happen, they will eventually essentially create too much litter. The soil becomes too cool, too damp. They'll get invaded with invasive species and just not be a healthy grassland. They need those ecosystem processes of grazing and fire to keep them healthy. Now, when they were evolving, fire was probably mostly caused by lightning. It could have been anthropogenic as well with First Nations. And grazing was primarily bison, along with antelope and deer, and gophers and grasshoppers are also grazers, just at a smaller scale. And now, with no great herds of bison, we're actually using cattle and horses and sometimes sheep as a proxy to allow that grazing to happen. And instead of lightning-caused fires at random times of year when everything's tinder dry, we do prescribed fires. And at that point, we can pick our weather and pick how much we want to burn. So that is sort of what prescribed fire is all about. And yeah, those two ecosystem processes are pretty important. We're not able to use them in all places yet. But in order to keep that habitat healthy, in order to keep the plant community vibrant for the critters that live there, you need to have grazing and fire.
So how long have you been using grazing and fire at Last Mountain Lake?
Well, that's a good question. It goes back a ways. So for fire, I believe it was 1989 when we first did an experimental fire to see if it would actually kill the plant community or if it would be beneficial. And I'll give a shout out to Ed Driver, who's passed away, but he did a really interesting study that showed that prescribed fire, at least small scale, in a few places at Last Mountain Lake, actually did beneficial things for the plant community. And so we finally had some hard science back in the 80s to show that it was good. And then we ended up doing some prescribed fire plans for discrete portions of the wildlife area and began trying to do a little bit at a time. It was a very slow learning process because you wanted to be conservative and not do too much too fast, because with fire you don't want it to do things that you don't set out to do. With grazing, well, I think the land, before we purchased some of it as a national wildlife area, much of it was being grazed. And so when we purchased it to be the wildlife area, I think we inherited some grazing along with it and found that it's actually good for the grassland and just kept on rolling with that.
So before you entered Last Mountain Lake, have you encountered prescribed fire before? What were your previous experiences with it and your first exposure to fire?
Well, it was somewhat peripheral. When I was growing up in Maple Creek, the PFRA irrigation district used to use fire to clear out their irrigation channels every spring before the water started flowing. I knew that happened, but I never actually saw it. It was just sort of a matter of fact. That's what happens in the spring. And then in my late teens, I got to participate in a few agricultural burns where there was a dry cattail slough in the middle of a farm field, and the farmer wanted to farm through it the next year, so we'd go and actually light the cattails on fire, which was quite a spectacle, but nothing really meant to improve habitat. It was all just to modify things to be structurally what we were looking for.
So you have touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a bit more about how Last Mountain's fire program came to be?
I sure can. So I think back in the late 1980s, Ed Driver who was a research scientist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, started doing some research into fire and whether it was damaging or beneficial to native prairie. And in the small plots that he did out at Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area, they found that there was actually a very positive response for health of natural grassland to low-intensity fires. So things that happened in usually mid to late spring or mid to late fall. So nothing at the heat of summer or the really dry times in August, but in those shoulder seasons, it was quite beneficial. And then there were a couple of ecologists, and I'm thinking specifically of Phil Taylor and then Dean Nurnberg, who were quite encouraging of allowing fire to happen because they'd seen the benefits. And they started getting some equipment and some, I don't know if there was a whole lot of training, but at least getting organized and having a plan and maybe a little bit of safety gear so that people wouldn't get hurt, and doing it as a larger group. And that is the bare bones of where we started with prescribed fire.
That's so amazing. So how many burns do you typically see in a year?
Well, that all depends on the weather. And we try to prepare for 3 to 4 units that we could burn in the spring and another 3 to 4 in the fall. And then, depending on what our goals are, we may burn either time of year, or we may have to do it at one specific time of year. But if we get 2 to 3 days with good weather where I've got a full burn crew available, that would be fairly normal. So we might get 2 or 3 units done in spring and another 2 or 3 in fall. Sometimes we get 1. Occasionally we get none because the wind just doesn't stop and we can't burn when there's a good solid wind going.
Can you speak more as to why prescribed fire is such an important tool here and what your exact burn objectives are in this particular wildlife area?
So prescribed fire in general, does things that nothing else can do. You can modify the structure of your grassland by sending in animals to eat it. You can cause a bit of nutrient cycling with that as well. But there are some real synergies that are happening with fire, with the temperature, with the smoke, with the ash, and with nutrient cycling that happens after things are combusted. The time of year and the plant growth stage that happens at is a big influence as well. And as well, while grazing can get at some things, if you're trying to remove some of the woody vegetation that they can't eat because it's too big, fire will actually burn that or at least knock it down and start the decomposition process. So fire does some unique things. It's best used in conjunction with grazing. And the timing can make a big difference. If you burn while, say, smooth brome grass, which is an invasive species, and if you burn it at about the 2 to 3 leaf stage, then it has just exhausted all its resources that stayed in the roots over the winter by putting up all those leaves, and then you take it off and essentially cook them. It has to do that all again, so it's lost all that energy. And if you then graze it afterwards, and all that fresh, lovely, smooth brome grass comes up and the cows nibble it right down again, you really, knock back the resources of that particular plant, and it doesn't thrive as much in this coming year. Conversely, the native prairie plants are often not growing yet. They tend to get going a little bit later in the season. And the cows will preferentially go after smooth brome that's regrowing. It has a little bit higher sugars in it, so I've heard people call it cow candy. And that's, then you've got this great synergy of fire, which will differentially knock back smooth brome. And then the cows will come back and preferentially go after the smooth brome and leave the native grasses alone. So you've got both fire and the grazing working on your side if you time things right. If you burn things in the fall, especially after everything has senesced or gone brown and dead, then it makes less difference. You can clear off litter without actually impacting many of the plants in the community. So you can do different things with your timing at different times of year.
Could you elaborate more on the impact that you've seen on wildlife and plants as well post-burns? Whether it's a week after, a month after, do you see major differences given the time?
So there's quite a bit of reaction that happens to a fire. If we burn in sort of mid to late spring, everything that was burned is black. So black attracts more heat from the sun, or absorbs more heat from the sun. And so things start growing in your burned area faster and more uniformly than some of the other areas that have litter and are still a little cooler and damper. That can result in things greening up faster. It also acts as a little bit of fertilizer. So it causes carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus cycling. And so often you can cause some of your native plant species to really thrive. They'll go to seed, they'll go to flower, they'll be bigger and more lush than previous years. I have a few favorite memories of that. One is we burned what's called the gravel pit prairie, and must have done it at precisely the right time for blue-eyed grass. And my word, 2 weeks later, the place was covered. You couldn't walk without stepping on blue-eyed grass, which is one of Saskatchewan's only native irises. It's an itty-bitty little iris. They were everywhere, and we've never seen that many there before or after. I've also got the privilege of having done a prescribed fire one fall, and the nutrient cycling must have been substantial, because the year after that, the western porcupine grass, which is a spear grass, I have never seen such dense flowering heads. There were seeds everywhere. It was just quite spectacular. I've never seen anything like that before or since either. So fire definitely has an impact, and definitely can be quite a positive thing.
For sure. Do you know if there's any research? Have you done any research out at Last Mountain Lake that backs any of this up?
We haven't done a huge amount of research. Before we got started with the fire program, we did, or I shouldn't say we, because it was Ed Driver, did that initial study to make sure that we weren't going to be harming things. And there have been research projects that we've contributed to, as well as I think we assisted with a study on the Saskatchewan prairie lilies, which is our floral emblem for the province. They grow at Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area, and there were two researchers, Anna Layton and Bonnie Lawrence, who were studying their life cycle and what was affecting them. So we applied fire to a couple of small plots to give them some evidence as to what fire was doing to the lily population, both the seeds and the existing plants. So that was pretty interesting. They're all part of the cycle.
Can you talk about more about the specific types of wildlife and plants that are at Last Mountain Lake? And are there any species at risk, and how does fire impact those species?
Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area is in the moist mixed prairie grassland. That's its eco zone. So that means it's got a little more moisture than some parts of Saskatchewan. It's got a few slightly taller grasses. Our dominant grasses in the native prairie are western porcupine grass, June grass, northern and western wheatgrass, and in the areas with high salinity, we also have poverty weed and slender wheatgrass, and Nuttall's alkali grass as well. That's pretty common in some places. For wildlife species, well, let's see. For the mammals, we've got white-tailed and mule deer. We have the occasional elk and or moose coming through. I don't think they stick around for too long. We've got coyotes and foxes and badgers, which actually there's quite a few badgers around this year, it seems. There's badger holes everywhere. We have the ubiquitous Richardson's ground squirrel, or standard prairie gopher. Northern pocket gophers, which some folks call moles because they leave behind big hills of dirt. We also have Franklin's ground squirrels and 13-line ground squirrels, along with a whole variety of mice and voles and shrews, all the little brown furry things that live underground. For birds, we do have some of the native prairie obligate species, so critters that are birds that can't live anywhere but native prairie. Sprague's pipit, Baird's sparrow, and a few other excellent ones like that. We've got some of the more common ones as well, like savanna sparrows and clay-colored sparrows, as well as a variety of swallows and flycatchers and all of the water birds as well. I could go on. They seem like old friends now, but they all need slightly different habitats. They all need slightly different place to live, things to eat, And so one of our main goals at Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area is habitat heterogeneity. So that's patchiness. We want there to be a patch for everything. Now, it doesn't have to be the same habitat in the same place every year, so it can change over time. But we do want to have those areas with super short grass and areas with a little taller grass and some areas with shrubs, and all of that in close proximity to water, because everything needs water. And so our management is to try and move these patches around and make sure that there's a little bit of something for everyone. So habitat heterogeneity is something that's really important. Just as an example, I'll use, let's try some Sprague's pipits and some clay-colored sparrows and maybe a bobolink or two. So those three species have very different habitat requirements. Sprague pipits need to have a little cup-shaped nest on the ground, usually in a bit of a hollow. They like pretty short grass so they can see things coming and see what's around them. Clay-colored sparrows like to have a little shrub to nest in. So something about knee-high, little cup shape in the top of a snowberry bush, for example. And bobolinks, they love the tall, shaggy grass. So something at least knee-high and just denser, thicker grass. So if I want to have a happy, functioning, moist mixed grassland ecosystem, it includes Sprague's pipits and clay-colored sparrows and bobolinks. So I need to be able to have a large enough patch of super short grass with no trees in it for my Sprague's pipits. I need to have some lovely little patches of snowberry for my clay-colored sparrows, but the Sprague's pipits really don't like to have too much snowberry around. And the bobolinks love that tall, shaggy grass, and they won't come anywhere near for nesting if it's all short. But the Sprague's pipits really don't like that tall, shaggy stuff that the bobolinks do. So you got to have substantial patches of each one of those habitat types, not right on top of each other. So you can't have one field that's got a little bit of short grass here, plus a snowberry bush beside it and some tall grass, 10 feet over. It's better to have, one field that may have 10 acres of low grass and a few big patches of snowberry, and then another field altogether that's got taller grass and maybe hasn't been grazed for a year. So in order to achieve all of that, you need to treat all of the habitats differently. And some of it is species composition and what plant species are actually growing there. Some of it's the moisture regime, how close it is to a wetland or how much rain it gets. And some of it is actually the soil type, because if it's too saline, snowberry bushes won't grow, for example. So a lot of it depends on what's there already, so the soil, the moisture regime, and what plants are growing there. But then I can modify that by bringing my vegetation managers in and mowing down, say, a field the size of a quarter section. Bring in cows for 3 to 4 weeks, bring in a fair number of them, and they'll nibble that right down short, and then you take them off to go graze elsewhere, and then you've got a substantial patch of that short grass that Sprague's pipits need. In other places, you've got snowberry bushes growing, and so maybe we'll graze it a little judiciously, not too intensively, to allow grass and snowberry bushes to stay intact. And maybe in that field, there's some shaggy stuff off in the corner that the cows didn't get to or weren't around for long enough, and that's suitable for the bobolinks as well as the clay-colored sparrows. And then maybe we put a fire through and burn the material that's still there. So the snowberry all will come from the base then. The above ground will have been burned off, so it comes from the base. And then the rest of that field would be super short, and the Sprague's pipit might actually come and investigate it. So I guess I'm trying to give an example of how things change over time and how the management interacts with the existing plant community and seed bank, as well as the soil type and moisture regime. It's a little complicated, but that's part of what makes it so interesting.
So in addition to Last Mountain Lake, you've also done prescribed fires elsewhere, such as the Department of National Defense at the Canadian Forces Base Afield in Alberta. So when did you do this, and what were your burn objectives there?
Well, that's a really interesting scenario. So the Minister of Environment, who is part of Environment Canada, delegated responsibility for a national wildlife area to the Department of National Defence. And that is at Canadian Forces Base Suffield, and it's called CFB Suffield National Wildlife Area. And it's an area of about 400 square kilometers near Medicine Hat, Alberta, between the Saskatchewan River and the active Canadian Forces Base. Essentially, it's a buffer. And that space has been absolutely incredibly important for wildlife, long before it was set aside as a protected area. But it's very important, especially now as things get more developed and our landscape is changing. It's more and more important. And so DND has actually done very well being responsible for this national wildlife area and making sure that it's looked after. They've got some excellent staff, both military and civilian, to help with that. It's been interesting because there are some species at risk on CFB Suffield National Wildlife Area called kangaroo rats, Ord's kangaroo rats in particular. And they're very cute. They have little kangaroo back legs and they hop around. They got super long tails and big eyes and very, very cute, as small mammals are. They need little runways because they jump and just the way they move. They can't actually have too much litter or too much interfering with where they go. So they need to have all these little pathways, and they live on sand dunes and burrow into the sand to make their homes. And so if the sand dunes get too vegetated and they have too much grass and forbs and even trees growing on them, they become unsuitable habitat for these little kangaroo rats. Now, that has been happening for quite a few years. So across Western Canada, sand dunes have been stabilizing for quite a few years. Decades, in fact. And as the sand dunes stabilize and get more and more vegetation on them, they become less and less suitable for Ord's kangaroo rat. So this little species is not very common anymore. The sand dunes that have open sand on them are becoming fewer and further between. And so the little populations of Ord's kangaroo rat living in the open sand can't move from one population to the next. And or they don't have enough suitable habitat right where they are. And so, their numbers are dwindling quite rapidly, and they're in significant trouble. So one of the suggestions from the recovery team was that perhaps prescribed fire might be able to reverse that trend, make the habitat more suitable. And so I believe our first fire was in 2018, and we worked in conjunction with the Forward Operating Section fire crew at CFB Suffield National Wildlife Area, and they were a delight to work with. They brought all their fire suppression equipment with them and helped us to essentially put a ring of fire around the base of one of the big dunes and then just let it burn up the sides. And worked really well. And when we went up to the very top where the Ord's kangaroo rat habitat was there, we noticed that the wind was starting to blow the sand around a little bit on the toes of our boots and such. Well, the next year, the Ord's kangaroo rat had a banner year. They did so well. Their population increased. They thrived. And so seeing that kind of evidence meant that there is actually something concrete we can do right now that has a huge tangible benefit on this particular species at risk. And so we've been trying to get the right window of opportunity to actually make that happen in subsequent years. And between weather and scheduling, it's difficult, but we've managed to do a few more fires as well. And so that's been really rewarding to see the benefits so quickly and so immediately with the population of Ord's kangaroo rats. But I will point out the vegetation keeps growing, and the dunes that we burned, in 2018 are pretty much back where they were in 2018. Before we burned them. So, it's been 6-7 years, and that many years of growth without any other modification have gotten us back to a vegetating sand dune that isn't really great habitat for the kangaroo rats anymore. So it needs to be done regularly.
Okay, so you would just need to do another burn.
Yeah, doing a burn on the dune every, I would dare to say 5 years would probably be a good thing to aim for. But, this is all up for discussion, and there's a lot of logistics that go into it. So it's not just as easy as saying, oh, we need to burn that every 5 years. That may be ideal, but there's a lot of other factors that go into it.
Have there been any other species in this wildlife area that have improved with prescribed fire?
That's a good question. We've noticed a flush of blooming from plant species that are around there. So some of the sunflowers bloom profusely the year after a prescribed fire. But being able to see how species do after a burn, you actually have to have a before and an after count. And having those before and after studies, while very important, sometimes you just don't have the time and money to do them. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So, is that considered kind of a barrier with some organizations, is not being able to have, a sufficient monitoring program?
Well, you always want to have some sort of monitoring to make sure that you're achieving what you set out to do. But yeah, time and money, that's always a barrier. So you kind of want to know what the most important thing to achieve is and make sure that you keep your finger on that pulse. And other things may be in the order of nice to-dos, or maybe you can collaborate with someone else who's doing something of the sort and, maximize your time and effort.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that emphasizes on the importance of CPPFE and interagency collaboration.
Cooperation and collaboration? Why, yes, it does.
We talk a lot about, these specific wildlife areas that you've worked in. So you're under Environment and Climate Change Canada, correct?
That's correct.
Do you know more about what their relationship to prescribed fire is as a whole?
Well, I think it's considered an important habitat management tool in many different ecosystems, not just the grasslands. However, forested ecosystems take a lot more effort to do prescribed fires, a lot more time, and a lot more fire suppression experience, I believe. And so compatriots of mine, colleagues of mine in other parts of the country, have actually either worked with the province's wildfire group that does some prescribed fires as they have time, in years where it's appropriate. This year, maybe not so much. Or, I believe in Ontario, there are some groups that will do prescribed fire as consultants. We've actually hired people to come in and do prescribed fire.
So continuing on that, how do you keep your fire program moving when working under such a big federal system?
Well, because it's an important management tool for managing natural grasslands, we figure out ways of actually making it happen. So I have a number of different staff that work not just for my unit, but for other units that I can borrow from for a few days of the year. We make sure we all have the right training and protective equipment, and we usually do a refresher course in April where we go back over how to use all the equipment, some of our ignition patterns, how to do things the right and the safe way. And then, we do a lot of planning and some site preparation to make sure that things go smoothly once we get there. And that planning and preparation is probably the most time. It just takes time and somebody to do it. So my organization, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service, has been quite supportive of this. They see the necessity of it. And so it's something that we've been doing, I think it was 1992 was when we first started doing prescribed fires, and we've been going ever since then. We've been getting better and more professional, and sort of having the right tools for the job is important.
Of course. And what exactly are those tools, if you don't mind? Talk more about the equipment.
Mm-hmm. Well, having a mower that can go over many things allows you to prepare your fire boundary and give yourself a bunch of short grass or short vegetation to work in. But I think probably the single most important thing to have is a mobile water unit. And we use a side-by-side. So that's one of those UTVs that has a box where you can put a water tank with a little hose reel and a pump. And so you'll have maybe 60 gallons, or that's about 200 liters of water in the back, and a little pump that will help you put it through a hose with a nozzle that can change its spray from a fan to a stream. And that little mobile water unit allows you to go where you need it, when you need it. We used to do it mostly with water backpacks, and they each have a piston sprayer on them. Those are very effective. You still can do a prescribed fire with them. I would dare to say them only if you set it up right. But having the extra water that goes in the back of the UTV and having that pump to put it where you want it, when you want it, is very important. It's also quite mobile. You can go quite fast in those if need be, so you can take it from one side of a fire to the other, and that's just a lot quicker than if you had somebody carrying a water backpack. We also have things like hand tools. We have flappers, which are essentially a long broomstick with a rubber flap about, let's say 16 inches wide by 16 inches long on the end. And that allows us to smother the fire. You don't actually flap them. You actually spread. It's like spreading peanut butter on toast. You actually smear them along the ground, and that deprives the fire of oxygen, puts it out. As well, we've got some rakes, which can help you move vegetation around a bit. And one of the other really helpful things that doesn't actually make sense at first, leaf blowers. If you're working in a mowed line and trying to keep fire from getting into the mowed line, having a leaf blower on your back and just blowing it right back on itself is probably the single most effective thing you can do for a fire. It's highly effective. Now, it only works when the fire is small. I wouldn't do that with anything over a meter or so. But it's great. So we've got leaf blowers, we've got water backpacks, we've got mobile water units, which can be a side-by-side or UTV. We've got flappers and rakes, and then we've got some of the larger equipment. So a truck with what some people call a skid pack on the back, so a slide-in water unit that's got a water tank, pump, and hose reel on it. As well as we do have some bigger water trailers as well, just as refill mostly, but they can spray as well. So we've got a little bit of everything, but those side-by-sides with water in the back are just the cat's meow for this.
So speaking about the importance of this equipment, so like every April you do host a prescribed fire refresher that gathers fire practitioners from across all these agencies to review how to use this fire equipment. And so like, why is reviewing this equipment and these skills so important?
If you don't keep your skills up by using them, then they get rusty, you forget little bits. It's really important to keep yourself fresh. Because we only do prescribed fires in the spring and the fall at this point, that's a lot of months in between that you can get rusty and forget things. There's also changes between different agencies' equipment and even our own equipment. If a pump fails, we have to swap it out with something else. Maybe that has a different startup routine or buttons in different places. We've always done a spring refresher for ourselves. And then with the advent of the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, it's like, well, we're doing it anyhow. Bring everybody else out. We might as well have a group event, and also others can bring equipment. We can try out each other's equipment and just make sure that we all know how to work this stuff. And it's really quite fun. We gamify it to make it more entertaining, but also to add a little bit of time pressure to it. So once we've gone over everything and had a refresher on how to use the pumps and the leaf blowers and the UTV and all the water packs and such, then we have an obstacle course. We split ourselves into teams and actually have a race to go through all of these different pieces of equipment and show that we know how to use them properly. The race means that there's a bit of time pressure on it without, having a fire nipping at your heels. And it's quite a bit of fun. You get bragging rights. Occasionally we come up with some prizes too. But it's a fun way to refresh our skills and also to make sure that we're sort of ready for the season to come and sharpened up.
I remember there also being a pack test.
So yes, the pack test. It's a challenge. So grassland firefighting is physically demanding, whether it's carrying heavy water packs or walking for miles and miles and miles with a flapper in your hand, or getting in and out of the back of a truck to start a pump. You have to be able to move continually and work hard for the entire fire window. Sometimes that's upward of 8, 9, 10 hours. So in order to make sure that everyone has somewhat of a baseline of fitness and the ability to do this, we do have a couple of tests. One is the pack test, and that is walking 2 miles with a 25-pound pack in under 30 minutes. Now, we always have some competitors who try to get the fastest time possible, looking at you, Jeff Harder, and that's lots of fun. But as long as you're there in under 30 minutes, it means that you've got the capability to do that kind of aerobic exercise with weight on your back. We also sometimes do a pump test, which is lifting one of our water pumps and carrying it for 100 meters and setting it down again. They're not super strenuous tests. They're not like some of the wildland tests that are very strenuous. But they're just meant to make sure that our staff have the fitness and aren't going to hurt themselves just by spending time on a fire. I do want to point out that the pack test and the pump test are things that the Canadian Wildlife Service requires from its staff. Every agency's got its own standards for fitness of its staff in order to do prescribed fires. And that's what we've settled on in Canadian Wildlife Service. It is somewhat a universal standard, the type 2 pack test, but that might not be what suits other organizations. So it's what we do, but it's not for everybody.
So continuing on that, like including hosting these prescribed fire refreshers, you've also taken on other leadership roles like leading burns at your own sites and stepping into at our upcoming Canadian Prairies Treks an operations chief role. So what brought you to take on more of these leadership roles on the fire line?
I think just that the need was there, because when people retire or move on to other jobs, suddenly there's a gap. And I was the most experienced person in our organization to be able to step into that gap. And so I did. Now, it's a lot of work, but it's also really gratifying. Working on a prescribed fire is a very, I don't know, it's an excellent work experience when everything comes together at the same time. So I've always enjoyed it. It's really dynamic and it's somewhat demanding. And, I was the most experienced person, so I saw the need to step up and did. And now, yes, you're right, I've just agreed to be the operations chief for the training exchange happening in October of 2025. And that's mostly because there was a space there. And the purpose of this training exchange is for all of us to stretch ourselves a little bit. And I'm getting used to the role that I've been in for 20-some years maybe. And so, stepping up to a new role and taking on different responsibilities is part of stretching myself. If everybody else is doing it, I should as well. So here I am.
Going in more into leadership, can you talk about what your favorite and least favorite parts about leading a burn operation are?
Well, I'm going to start with my favorite. My favorite part of a prescribed fire operation is probably that moment just before you close off the ring. Most of our prescribed fires are done in a ring format where you start at 6 o'clock on the clock and move both directions, clockwise and counterclockwise, up to 9 and 3, and then close off at 12. Just when you see the two ignition teams about to meet each other, and then you'll have your fire completely surrounded by black, and you can just let it do its thing in the middle. I tend to find that the most satisfying moment. It means my crew have all done their jobs, we did the right preparation, the ignition's been working, and then you can sit back and watch. I guess it is an ecological process, fire is, and it's almost like it's alive, like it consumes fuel, it needs oxygen. The wind can make it, expand or diminish. And so to watch it actually go through the different fuel types and send up different colors of smoke, and that, it just went into the cattails. So all that really intense smoke and fire whirls are because of the intensity of the fire in the cattails. And, there's a little slope and it just ran up that slope and got into the wolf willow, and now there's copper-colored smoke coming up there. That's partly what I appreciate the most. And then the other part is just the teamwork. When you're working together as a seamless team and accomplishing something like this, it's very satisfying. Professionally speaking, it's just one of the most satisfying activities I have professionally. What are the drawbacks of leadership? When you become the incident commander, the person who's in charge of the fire, you don't get to actually light the fire anymore, because you're supposed to be holding back and watching the play happen, watching the fire progress, and making sure things happen at the right time and folks are in doing what they need to at the right time. Instead of being out there with a drip torch myself or being out there with a flapper myself. So some of our fires are small enough and require a smaller crew, and so I do get to do that occasionally, but yeah, I kind of miss being the one lighting the fire because I'm calling the shots now.
Could you explain more about leading other fire practitioners and what your approach to coaching and mentoring people on the fire line is, whether they're like brand new or they're working their way up to a more professional or experienced or higher level?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I like the best about this training exchange model is that everybody has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. And, I would challenge anybody that I think I learn more at these training exchanges than anybody else does. But I suspect others feel the same way. And so I really like the on-the-line learning. So I find someone who's looks like they're a bit hesitant doing what their role is, whether, just as an example, if they've got a drip torch and they're the ones lighting the fire, and they're a little hesitant, I'll go stand by their shoulder and talk them through what they need to do next. And walk with them at the pace they should be walking. And okay, now look behind you and see, is your holding crew scurrying around like ants? If they look like they're really busy, you wait for a minute. You let them catch up. When the activity slows down, then you can proceed. And just that on the line, moment to moment coaching, telling them what to look for, how to proceed, who to check in with, what to anticipate, because the fuel type's changing ahead of you, and you're going to stumble on some of these bushes. They'll also burn hotter, so make sure you have a way picked to go through it. Things like that I find them really gratifying. I find them also very useful. I learn really well that way when somebody's telling me these kinds of details, and so I like to do that for other people as well. I've heard from them that it's a really helpful way to learn too. And that goes to different roles as well. So if I'm mentoring a holding crew leader, I'm telling them, okay, you haven't checked in with this person behind you for 3-4 minutes. You should just either lay eyes on them or radio them, see how things are going in their part of the world. How's your water doing in your water suppression units? Is there anybody who's been working really hard or looks like they need a break? We should cycle them out with somebody else. And just sort of that continual checking in with a glance that you do instinctively once you're good at it. But if you're just learning, lifting that off the page or taking it from theory to practice is sometimes a little difficult. And then when mentoring incident commanders, getting your face out of the fire and looking at the big picture of the landscape that you're affecting is the hardest part, because we're so used to doing our jobs as individuals and making sure that it's going the way it's supposed to, that it's really hard to step back from the action and look at what's happening. There's a thunderstorm over there, so the wind is going to start shifting. These guys are having a really hard time getting things lit right there. What's going on? Do I need to slow down this ignition line because the other one isn't going nearly so fast and I don't want to run a head fire at them yet? So things like that. It really, really helps to have that little person perched on your shoulder talking you through some of this stuff if it's your first time around. Because again, knowing it in theory and then actually activating it in person when you're in the middle of it, you don't want to make a mistake. And so having that person on your shoulder telling you what to look for and what's coming up next is really important. And also reassuring. If I'm mentoring someone, I don't want to let them, quote, learn from their mistakes by making a big, awful mistake. Like, that's not helpful. I want to sort of reel them in before they get to that point. And so that's, when I'm being mentored, that's a great reassurance. I know my mentor's not going to let me fall on my nose and cause a big issue. So that's, that's why I like this training exchange setup and why it's so valuable. It's an intensive time, but my goodness, you can learn a lot in a short period of time from this.
For sure. I'm very excited to start and a bit intimidated to enter treks for the first time, but it definitely is reassuring to know that there's that support available on the fire line.
100%. We're not there to let people make mistakes and fail, right? That's not the goal of it.
I'm curious because fire, I feel like especially in the short time I've been here, I've noticed it's a relatively male-dominated industry. So I'm curious, as a woman in power on the fire line, if I can describe it that way, woman in power, a woman in leadership.
Sounds pretty good.
A woman in power. What's been your experience like taking on these roles as a woman in such a male-dominated industry?
That's a really interesting question because I've never felt in prescribed fire that I was somehow a woman in a male-dominated industry. It was just we were all trying to figure out how to work together to make prescribed fire work. I think that's probably due to a number of things. Number one, this isn't wildfire. I think it is perhaps a bit more male-dominated in the wildfire situation and in the forestry fields. The grassland practitioners are a pretty small group. We all know each other, and many of us have spent our careers paralleling each other in different organizations and occasionally shifting organizations. So we all know each other, we all respect each other, and I've never felt that gender really came into it, to be honest. And I think that's pretty awesome thing to be able to say. I've had a pretty good existence. So my organization has obviously been supportive, and the people around me who have now all come together to make the CPPFE are the same thing. I will point out, I think our last 2 training exchanges have been more than 50% female participants, which is pretty awesome. Let's keep going. I think my feeling is, unlike in perhaps the wildfire industry, we are 50% of the people who are involved. And so it's much less of an issue to have gendered expectations. I think we're starting to think a little bit more about individual requirements rather than having it be associated with the gender. We are looking at some things like, we've got some very small people working on our fire crew. So let's look at getting some drip torches that aren't a full gallon of mixed fuel. Let's try something a little smaller, and maybe it's, a little less tiresome and easier to handle for people with smaller stature. But that's not necessarily a gendered thing. So, I think to me it's been a non-issue, a non-starter. And I'm really pleased and proud to be able to say that. I feel like from my time at the CPPFE, I've noticed that it does definitely seem to be more of a collaborative thing that I haven't noticed really many barriers in terms of gender. I'm glad to hear that. I sometimes wonder if my own peculiar view on the world, and I did start out being one of the only female technicians in my unit, with very male dominated that way, and so maybe I've become accustomed to some of this, but I really don't think so. I think it's quite equitable, and people are people.
And it's super encouraging, even in other industries too, in STEM, and just seeing more and more women go into these roles, and seeing a 50-50 ratio for treks. It's very promising. And there's even there's a women's treks I think it's in Nebraska this year too, and that encourages more women to go into prescribed fire as well. So it's very encouraging to see, I think.
Oh, it's pretty cool. Fire doesn't care what gender you are.
That's so true.
It really doesn't. So let's start at that equalizing level.
Do you have any advice about really anyone actually, like whether it be a young woman or anybody who's like interested in going into prescribed fire or like fire ecology or even wildlife management in general. Do you have any advice on what a young person would need to do to get into that role?
I think number one, I would say follow your passion. If you can figure out what motivates you, what makes you want to do a good job, what makes you want to get up in the morning and go to work, take some time when you're young to figure that out, and then follow that passion. For me, this passion for nature, the delight in ecology, because it's such a complicated puzzle, we'll never figure it out, that's been part of my driving passion. Fire is a component of that, and I love it. But wanting to work with fire has made sure that I stay in shape because it's physically demanding. So I actually work out quite strenuously through the off season from fire to make sure that I'm fit enough to actually do what I need to do during the fire season. I have learned ecology. I've been reading papers and making associations with other people who do research to make sure that we're doing the right things with fire, both using it in the right way on the landscape and trying to mimic what would have happened naturally. Because if we're trying to keep our grassland ecosystems healthy, we have to essentially mimic the forces that created them and shaped them in the first place. I would say to people who are coming into this field new, listen to our First Nations neighbors. We share land with them through the treaties. We're all treaty people. It's a different perspective than you get from university and Western science. It's just as valid. There's something called two-eyed seeing, where you have one eye firmly in the Western science and the other eye firmly in the Indigenous perspective. And you see through both lenses at the same time. They're not contradictory. They can work together. So I would really encourage people getting into this to learn from our Cree and Soto neighbors. Listen. You'll go through some uncomfortable times. Be okay with that. Canada's got a pretty uncomfortable history, and we have to acknowledge that. And sometimes sit with that and maybe even shed a few tears, because Canada's got a pretty horrible history in some cases. But as the first stewards of this land, and the folks who listen and have a spiritual relationship with the land as well, we need to learn from and listen to First Nations. So as I really promote that. I'm trying to do that myself. I had a long way to go to be good at it. So, this is a message to myself as well. Where we're at right now isn't a good place. We need to change the status quo. And I think if we all work towards that, then maybe we'll actually end up somewhere that we want to be. And that would be marvelous. Where that is, I don't know. So those of you who are listening and thinking about getting into this, that's up to you. You can shape the future.
I think acknowledging that a bit more, acknowledging the important relationship between Indigenous peoples and fire within the history of cultural burning for generations. Have you, or Environment and Climate Change Canada, have you been working with Indigenous groups in implementing elements of cultural burning into your fire program?
I would love to say yes to that, but we're not there yet. We're still in the process of building a relationship with the peoples that, in my case, at Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area and Treaty 4, we're still building a relationship with the people who traditionally would have, come through this area as part of their annual cycle. A lot's been lost. Thank you, residential schools. Thank you, cultural genocide. But there's still a lot there to be found and a lot to be nurtured. And so, there's a lot more work to be done. I don't think it'll be something that gets accomplished in my lifetime, which is, I'm sad to say, but it's also hopeful because we've got a path forward. And I think listening and learning together is actually one of the best ways to do that. So, again, encouraging everyone to listen and learn together.
So my final question for you is, what do you envision the future of your fire program being at Last Mountain Lake and for your own personal journey in the fire world?
I foresee this marvelous future where I have probably 24 Canadian Wildlife Service staff who I can call on at a moment's notice to come and help me with a fire in the spring or the fall. I envision equipment that won't fail and have my main pump go down when we're starting the fire. That would be awesome. Probably not realistic. The equipment always fails. But I also have this idea that fire becomes just a regular part of land management. It doesn't have to be back to the normal fire frequency that would have happened on this landscape necessarily, but where fire is an option and achieve some specific things on the landscape. I think having it as one of the possible management tools would be very good in complement with grazing. And for myself, I have this idea that I'd actually like to have a spin-off event. I'd like to have a training exchange, maybe specifically for Canadian Wildlife Service and or federal staff, hosted at Last Mountain Lake. So we'll see if I actually get to do that. But that's the dream at this moment.
More training exchanges would be great. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or emphasize?
That this is a journey, and we're all starting together, and the journey is where we go. So be intentional with what you're doing. Be positive. Try to be optimistic and work together to get where we want to be, and that's having fire as a management option for much of our native prairie, and it's good for non-native species as well, or can be, but to keep that native prairie that we've got left in really good shape.
Thanks so much for joining me, Kerry. This was such an insightful chat. Thank you so much for coming all this way to be interviewed and be on Prairie Fire Lines. This is so great.
Thank you for the privilege and opportunity. It's lots of fun. See you guys out there.
Once again, a huge shout out to Kerry Hecker for being on this podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Prairie Fire Lines on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow the Canadian Prairie's Prescribed Fire Exchange on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, or visit our website at grasslandfire.ca to stay updated on all things prescribed fire in the prairies. Huge thank you goes out to the Weston's Prairie Grassland Initiative for making this project possible, and to all of you for listening. Until next time, stay curious about the power of prescribed fire. This is Prairie Fire Lines, where we keep the conversation burning. And I'm your host, Kat Zenz, signing off.